it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Hi folks, and welcome to Bob Dylan, A Head Full of Ideas, Season 3, Episode 7. I'm Chris Gregory. I'm the author of a book called Determined to Stand the Reinvention of Bob Dylan. I'm also working on a trilogy of Bob Dylan books, and the second one is called Minstrel Boy, and that's going to be about Dylan's middle period. I'm doing this as a trilogy in reverse, as a tribute to Bob and the way he never does things in the expected way. So we're continuing our study of nonsense songs from the Basement Tapes. Another song which pokes fun at the media process in a more obvious way is the rollicking $1 Million Bash. The song has an obviously light-hearted tone, epitomised by the comical chorus, which consists merely of the twice-repeated "Ooh, baby, ooh-ee," followed by "It's that $1 Million Bash." The song lumbers on in a rhythm dominated by Rick Danko's bass. Danko and Manuel give support on the sing-along refrain. Here, Dylan again uses more absurdist imagery and the substitution of keywords for comic effect, taunting listeners and challenging them to make sense of apparent nonsense. At the end of every verse, we are told that all the bizarre characters we will be introduced to will be meeting up at the fabled bash, presumably the party of the century. The song begins with a delightfully mocking portrait of figures whom one might liken to a Hollywood star and a member of her entourage arriving at the Oscars or some similarly self-congratulatory showbiz ceremony. That big dumb blonde with her wheel in the gorge, and Turtle, that friend of hers, with his checks all forged. The big dumb blonde's friend is presumably her manager, who is described as having his cheeks in a chunk and his cheese in the cash. This actually makes very little literal sense, but gives a brilliantly comical picture of the money-motivated Turtle. Among the other attendees are characters with more splendidly random names such as Sweet Cream and Silly Nelly. Dylan even throws in the line, "Along came Jones and emptied the trash," referring to two 1950s Lieberstoller novelty songs by the Coasters. Along Came Jones and Yakety Yak. Midway through the song, we again shift into a first-person narrative, including the wonderful description of what it's like to have a hangover. "I'm hitting it too hard, my stones won't take. I get up in the morning, but it's too early to wake." Finally, the narrator snaps out of this by punching himself in the face with his fist and declaring in a completely random way that "I took my potatoes down to be mashed." $1 Million Bash is undoubtedly a romp, particularly suited to live performance, although Dylan has only performed it live once, in 2005. It's been covered by many artists, including Fairport Convention, who put out a drunkenly raucous version on their classic album Unhalf Bricking 1969. If you've never heard this album, you really should check it out. It's an absolute work of genius. Like the Mighty Quinn, the song can be read as an extremely left-field comment on the falseness of the trappings of fame in general. It may also be another very coded statement about why Dylan has retreated from the media circus of being in the public eye. It shows the big party that all the other characters are heading for to be an essentially hollow and meaningless event. Dylan extends the genre of the drunkard song to the extremes of comic absurdity in Please Mrs. Henry, which again features a chorus that Dylan and his band members can relish while delivering the plaintively desperate and befuddled cry of "Please, Mrs. Henry, please," repeated, "I'm down on my knees and I ain't got a dime." The song begins with the rather splendid declaration that "I've already had 2 beers and I'm ready for the broom," which rhymes neatly with the request to Mrs. Henry, presumably a landlady of a drinking establishment of some kind, to Take me to my room. The song is delivered with a kind of distinctively drunken logic, including a line few of his fans could ever believe Dylan would deliver. I'm a good old boy. That is the favourite expression of southern crackers. The inebriated narrator declares that he has been sniffing too many eggs and later boasts in a surreal quatrain that stretches animal metaphors to the limit. It goes like this: I can drink like a fish, I can crawl like a snake, I can bite like a turkey, I can slam like a drake. As the song continues the narrator appears to be growing more desperate to relieve himself. Don't crowd me, lady, he pleads, or I'll fill up your shoe. And later, rather hilariously, I'm starting to drain, my stool's going to squeak. If I work too much farther, my crane's going to leak. Implying that unless he receives her help, he's going to wet himself. No response from Mrs. Henry is recorded, so we can only conclude that this does not end well. Get out of my pub, no doubt she says to him. If you're American, you want to know what I'm talking about, but I'll leave that as a mystery. Yeah, Heavy and a Bottle of Bread is another drunkard song, but with perhaps a little more substance. The chorus merely repeats the title line 3 times from the first and fourth verses, while verse 2 gives us 3 lots of get the loot, don't be slow, we're going to catch a trout, and verse 3 ends with the repeated take me down to California, baby. This is perhaps the most surreal song of all from the Basement Tapes, beginning as it does with the line, well, the comic book and me, we caught the bus, which is repeated in the final verse. We're also told that his female chauffeur has caught a cold and is in bed with a nose full of pus. Well, that's certainly a rhyme, isn't it? Dylan delights in offhand internal rhymes, such as, it's a one-track town, just brown. Despite the participants having caught the bus, we are later told that they are in the song heading for Wichita and a pile of fruit. The singer implores someone to pull that drummer out from behind that bottle, and later, in a very slapstick moment, to slap that drummer with a pipe that smells. The whole thing has the logic of a dream, which is enhanced by more spooky backing vocals from Danko and Manuel. Like Mrs. Henry, this is a song, however, with little serious intent, but its almost complete detachment from logic puts it in a category of its own in Dylan's oeuvre. This is certainly nonsense, but sublimely funny and cool nonsense. On the occasion of its only 2 live performances in 2002 and 2003, it was greeted rapturously by audiences who were delighted, it seems, to have the chance to hear such an obscurity. Don't You Tell Henry is another splendidly drunken ramble, which later became a staple of the band's live set. The first official release on the Basement Tapes in 1975 featured a rather cleaned-up version performed by the band, with Levon Helm on vocals. This is a far more professional take than the original version, where Dylan sings, but here the whole band appears to be having a ball, joining in with the raucous backing vocals. The song was performed only once by Dylan during his guest appearance with the band at the Academy of Music in New York on December the 31st, 1971. The basement recording is dominated by Rick Danko, who is playing a rather ludicrously out-of-tune trombone, which is prominent throughout the track and is even featured in an extremely wonky solo. However, the amateurishness of the playing only adds to the joie de vivre of the track. Again, the song has a simple and very, very catchy chorus. Don't you tell Henry, repeated, Apple's got your fly. There is no indication that Henry is any relation to Mrs. Henry in the other song. It seems to be a bit of a random name. Don't You Tell Henry is great fun, delighting in satirising cliches from country, gospel and blues songs. The first verse begins with a line from many gospel songs. I went down to the river. The protagonist discovers a little chicken down on his knees. He is apparently so drunk that he talks to the animal, pleading with him not to tell Henry. We never find out what Henry should not be told, although we might presume that he needs to be warned about some terrible event. Perhaps his apples have been eaten by flies, although the chorus actually suggests the opposite. The song appears to describe, in its rather delirious way, how the main character is searching for himself. In the third verse, he goes down to the beanery, which is an American term for a cheap restaurant, looking around just to see myself. He then encounters a group of farm animals who give him the usual message. In the final verse, he ends up in a whorehouse, but the building is apparently empty. He goes upstairs, and as his drunken delirium begins to clear, finally concludes that I see nobody but me. Lo and behold, is another bizarre, absurdist travelogue. Dylan pushes his experimentation with nonsense here to the extreme. The song could be said to be satirising those who expect him to be some kind of prophetic truth teller or the voice of a generation, very much like the mighty Queen or Tony Montgomery. The expression in the title, which has a biblical origin, is usually related to a surprising revelation, but is frequently used ironically to indicate disappointment at something that isn't really new at all. In this song, the narrator appears to feel hemmed in or trapped by the expectations of him that the general public holds, I guess, and so reverts to nonsensical explanations. Well, what would you do? I don't know. The song features another simple chorus. Lo and behold, looking for my lo and behold, get me out of here, my dear man. To which Manuel and Dylan add comically exaggerated vocal harmonies. Dylan speaks rather than sings the lines in the verses in the manner of country vocalists in their more moralistic moments. Halfway through the first of the two Basement Tapes versions, Dylan collapses in laughter after accidentally repeating a lyric. This only adds to the charm of the piece, which features the first-person narrator engaging in unlikely travels across the USA. At first, he sets out from San Antonio in Texas, arrives in Pittsburgh, announces his intention to go down to Tennessee, but ends up back in Pittsburgh again. The woman who he is supposed to meet in San Antonio never materialises. His travels are beset by absurd difficulties. On his first journey, we hear that the coachman hit me for my hook. The reference to a coachman seems to place the action in the distant past, but the phrase, though comically resonant, is deliberately obscure. We also hear that when the narrator tells the coachman his name, he hangs his head in shame. None of this is really explained. The second verse is the most wildly surreal and hilarious. When the narrator arrives in Pittsburgh, we hear that I found myself a vacant seat and put it down my hat. But the following lines consist of a very weird conversation, to which we are given absolutely no context. What's the matter with you, Molly dear? The narrator asks. What's the matter with your mound? She replies, what's that to you, Moby Dick? This is Chicken Town. At a stretch, one might see these names as references to James Joyce's Molly Bloom, famed for her explicitly sexual monologue in Ulysses, and Herman Melville's classic. The use of the terms mound, dick, and chicken may well be sexual innuendo. The narrator certainly seems to be searching for some kind of sexual fulfillment, which he clearly won't ever find. In the third verse, he tells us that he buys his girl a herd of moose, one that she could call her own. Isn't that what every girl wants? Yes, but the next day she comes back to him inquiring where they had flown away to. The narrator's response is to vow to get me a truck or something and run away to Tennessee. Well, again, wouldn't you? To express the futility he feels, he memorably declares that he will take my money and rip it up. The journey back to Pittsburgh is carried out on a Ferris wheel. Boys, I sure was slick, he boasts, telling us he will round that horn and ride that herd. Whether he's referring to the herd of moose, as the flying moose, of course, is unclear. Lo and Behold is arguably the most nonsensical of all of these songs. Its narrator is searching for something, but, like Mr. Jones in Ballad of the Thin Man, he really doesn't know what it is. Another song which is marked by sexual innuendo, perhaps more obviously, is Going to Acapulco. a languid ballad with some highly emotive vocalising by Dylan, backed by a distinctive swirling organ from Hudson. In terms of its subject matter, the song, which at 5 minutes 25 seconds is actually one of the longest in the Basement tapes, is a clear precursor to the band's masterpiece The Weight, which appears on Music from Big Pink. There's even a distinctive chord progression at the end of each chorus, which appears in Robbie Robertson's song. As in The Weight, the protagonist is a dissolute fellow who resolves his troubles by visiting his favourite prostitute. Danko and Manuel again add strong support to the choruses. The song is a kind of intimate confession, perhaps of the kind of sexual incontinence that those who become famous stars may fall victim to. As Dylan proclaims, a little menacingly, "I'm just the same as anyone else when it comes to scratching for my meat." He tells us that Rosemary, the prostitute, never does me wrong. She puts it to me plain as day and gives it to me for a song. The use of the expression for a song generally indicates an especially cheap deal. But here the intimation may be that the narrator is someone who, like Dylan, sells himself through his songs and thus himself is a kind of prostitute. It's a wicked life, the narrator proclaims, but everybody's got to eat. It's later suggested that given all the free service he gets at Rosemary's, he is some kind of pimp. It's not a bad way to make a living, he tells us in an aside, and I ain't complaining none. The sexual innuendo in I can pull my plum and drink my rum is fairly obvious here, as is the latter, every time the well breaks down, I just go pump on it some. Well, you can read your meaning into that if you like, can't you? I'll leave that to you. The strangest line in this oddly passionate confessional occurs near the end, in which the narrator shares with us that if someone offers me a joke, then I just say no thanks. It is tempting to interpret this as the narrator turning down offers of drugs, especially as part of the process of the Basement tapes may well be drying out from excessive drug use. Well, maybe. Going to Acapulco is, despite its apparently nonsensical elements, a heartfelt performance, which, unlike the other nonsense songs, does not attempt to be funny, but instead gives us a sad evocation of the results of excess. Although the narrator proclaims his satisfaction with this situation, the tone of extreme regret in the delivery of the song appears to contradict this. Open the Door Homer uses nonsensical logic in a different way. The song has another rousing chorus. Open the door, Richard, I heard it said before. Open the door, Richard, and I ain't gonna hear it said no more. Open the Door, Richard was a very popular song widely featured in minstrel shows in the 1940s, in which blackface performers, some of whom were actually African Americans, and the African Americans blacked up, strangely enough, acted out the scenario of a drunken man knocking on a door and trying to gain admittance. Why Dylan chose to use this phrase instead of the apparent title of the song is something of a mystery. It might be argued that in naming the song he was making some kind of reference to the author of the foundational texts of Western literature. Homer did indeed open the door to epic forms of storytelling, but the Richard reference makes more sense as the song introduces us to a series of apparently nonsensical paradoxes that cannot, by their nature, be explained logically. These strange homilies will never help gain admittance to wherever the door leads to. It might be argued that the door, in fact, leads to a world of everyday common sense. In the first homily, the lugubrious narrator, adopting the tone of an old-timer in a western, chewing the fat over his bacon and beans, tells us, "Now there's a certain thing that I learned from Jim that he'd always make sure I'd understand, that there's a certain way a man must swim if he expects to live off the fat of the land." Yeah, well, get your head around that one. We never find out who Jim might be. In fact, his name and that of the narrator's other friends, Mouse and Mick, seems to be chosen because they produce neat rhymes. In the second verse, Mouse, who we are told is the fella who never blushes, advises the narrator that one must always flush out his house if you don't expect to be housing flushes. Both of these paradoxes take us into Lewis Carroll territory. Dylan enunciates with great sincerity, despite the apparently drunken context. The song makes a virtue of stating the obvious in a curiously ironic way. The third homily, delivered by Mick, is more pointed. Remember when you're out there trying to heal the sick, that you must always first forgive them. This may be considered to be something of a barb directed at sanctimonious religious people, but this, as well as the previous statements, also has a highly ironic undercurrent. The door to common sense will never be open for Richard or Homer, and he will remain perpetually trapped by his own logical limitations. The song can therefore be seen as a comment on false intellectualism or religious belief. The sly inference in the last verse about healing depicts the narrator as someone who aspires to the role of prophet, which Dylan himself rejects so vehemently. Perhaps the most appealing of this group of songs is You Ain't Going Nowhere, which has attracted multiple cover versions and has become an alt country standard. It was played around hundreds of times on the Never Ending Tour between 1997 and 2012. It's a whimsical piece of supposed nonsense with an attractive and catchy melody, built around another logical paradox with a sweetly appealing chorus. Ooh-wee, ride me high, tomorrow's the day my bride's gonna come. Ooh-wee, we're gonna fly, down in the easy chair. The Byrds version on their first country rock album proper, Sweethearts of the Rodeo, 1968, is perfectly paced, with the addition of a mournful steel guitar. There are two versions in the Basement tapes, the first of which appears to have mostly dummy lyrics. By the time the second tape is recorded, however, Dylan has refined the song considerably. It now uses quite an exquisite run of rhyming couplets. Cloud so swift, rain won't lift, gate won't close, railings froze. Dylan grew up in and is thus highly attuned to the weather of the North Country. Here he delights in the beauties of winter. The narrator appears to be addressing someone who has no choice but to stay put. He's probably addressing himself. But unlike the frustrated protagonist of Open the Door Homer, he has nothing to prove. The song has often been linked to Dylan's period of recuperation after his motorcycle accident, when he was indeed trapped in an easy chair, while his mind was riding high with new perspectives and ideas. The song has several delicious rhymes, especially in the third verse. Buy me a flute and a gun that shoots, Dylan sings, tailgates and substitutes. Strap yourself to the tree with roots. He sounds quite content to be in this situation. A tailgate, as well as being the part of a truck that can be lowered to load up goods, is also a style of improvised trombone playing, very much favoured by early jazz musicians from New Orleans. A Tree with Roots was the title of one of the more comprehensive bootleg collections of the Basement tapes, no doubt considered to be an appropriate title for the whole collection. That's what the Basement tapes might have been called, perhaps, if it was actually released. In itself, it's a tautology. All trees do, of course, have roots. We know this, but this is the kind of wordplay that Dylan loves. The title of the song is yet another of his distinctive double negatives. This is especially effective here. The subject of the song may be stuck in his chair in a physical sense, but in his mind, in contrast, he's decidedly heading somewhere. The final verse features a striking logical and historical shift. Genghis Khan he could not keep, all his kings supplied with sleep. We'll climb that hill, no matter how steep, when we get up to it. The final line indicates the main character's determination to eventually get out of his chair and climb every mountain in his future life. Nothing will hold him back. The earlier lines again hint at the use of sleep as a metaphor for mind-altering substances. Genghis, like virtually all the other briefly mentioned characters in the Basement tapes, is presumably using a pseudonym. Maybe he's a drug dealer from town that the character is waiting for. Or perhaps the line indicates the powerlessness of the mighty when dealing with ordinary human needs, again emphasising the narrator's message that patience is now very much required. Sleep will be coming soon, it seems. Although this was the standard set of lyrics Dylan later used when the song became a staple of his live act, when he re-recorded the song in 1971 for the More Greatest Hits album, accompanied by Greenwich Village acolyte Happy Traum on banjo, guitar, bass and backing vocals, he substituted an almost completely different set of lyrics. This was a rather strange move, given that Dylan's original would not actually be released for another 4 years. The song now begins like this: "Cloud so swift, rain falling in, gonna see a movie called Gunga Din. Pack up your money, pull up your tent, McGuinn." In the Byrds version, Roger McGuinn had sung the lines from verse 2 as "pack up your money and pick up your tent," getting pack and pick in the wrong order, and here Dylan generally mocks his friend for the mistake. The rest of the rewrite is full of verve and zing. We now hear, in a rather obscure reference to the Everly brothers, Phil and Don, that Genghis Khan and his brother Don could not keep on keeping on. The new final verse is also something of a tour de force, with Dylan clearly delighting in the lines, "Buy me some rings and a gun that sings, a flute that toots and a bee that stings." This is followed by another very well considered pair of couplets: "A sky that cries, and a bird that flies, a fish that walks, and a dog that talks." Quite ecstatic and inspired nonsense, of course, but highly amusing and cheerfully uplifting. It's not surprising that the song has become very popular with Dylan cover bands, as its swinging style is guaranteed to please an audience. The Basement Tapes is a unique set of songs in which Dylan and the band, in searching for musical roots, can be said to have created the entire genre of Americana, which now features as an official category for Grammy and other awards. Americana has largely superseded what was once known as folk music, the artificially pure form epitomised by performers like Pete Seeger, Peter, Paul and Mary and the Kingston Trio, who presented American roots music in a rather bowdlerised form. Perhaps that's a bit unfair to Pete Seeger, but in contrast, Dylan gets down and dirty here, identifying the American folk past as being populated by very dubious characters such as pimps, whores, gangsters and gamblers. And yet these songs are, as we have seen, largely suitable for children, at least on the surface anyway, unless they've got a very good imagination. Despite their suggestive subject matter and the apparently nonsensical content of the verses, they all have very attractive and singable choruses. The Basement Tapes is actually like a set of pop songs. I wouldn't really say that about many other collections of Dylan songs, would you? They use humorous lyricism in an extremely artful way to express Dylan's own disillusionment with the music business and its attendant star system. Dylan has dropped out of the system and he's singing these songs which he's not going to release to anybody. Well, not yet anyway. At the same time, even many decades after their composition, it's hard to listen to these songs without, at least once, cracking into a smile. That's the end of part 2 of nonsense songs from the Basement Tapes. A lot of other songs from the Basement Tapes, of course, and we'll be covering those at some point in the future, I expect. Well, thank you very much for listening. Please remember to like and subscribe to the podcast, and you'll find out when the next exciting episode is coming out. Back soon. Bye.
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?